Oh, good morning, Toledo. I am so delighted to be spending time with you all this morning. It seems like years ago that I came to Toledo to actually teach a workshop, but it was only back in early March, just before COVID hit. And so I'm thrilled that I at least know where you're hanging out and can picture you all there, and just delighted that you've chosen to spend time with me this morning. Heather, I also want to thank you and the foundation for inviting me to be part of your story, because I think, one of the gifts of COVID-19 is that we're all learning to work in new and creative ways. And, while the experience has certainly not been pleasant for any of us, I have a feeling that a lot of good is going to come out of this. And it's going to come down to storytelling. How can you tell your story in a way that brings more people on board with you? And so that's what we're going to explore today. Whoops, here we go. We're going to talk about four things. First, why it's important to start with your why. Second, how do we compel people to actually take action? Third, how do we make the right ask, which is going to increase the likelihood that they'll take action? And fourth, how do you create consistent campaigns? And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with Simon Sinek, but I am a huge Simon Sinek fan. He has a fabulous TED Talk, and if you've never watched it, it is well worth watching. He's also the author of several great books, including Start With Your Why and Find Your Why. And so this portion of the presentation is really geared towards the finding your why, both as individuals and as an organization. And so he explains it this way, and of course he was talking about individuals. I have adapted for the nonprofit context, but he says, if anybody asks you about your organization, most of us will start with what we do, and then some of us will get to how we do it, right? And very few of us ever get to the why. So we want to know, why is this a problem? So imagine if Apple Computer communicated like we do. Their story or sales pitch might go something like this. We make great computers. They're beautiful, easy to use, and user-friendly. Would you like to buy one? As a consumer hearing that kind of pitch, I'm like, why should I pay 3 times more for a computer when I can get an HP or something for a third of the price? Not terribly compelling. But Apple Computer is very good about flipping the script, and they start with their why. And the reason it matters about starting with your why is that that's what people really care about. So if you're thinking about this in a nonprofit context, then you want to speak about the outcomes that you achieve, because that is your why. Your why, every day that you go to work, blood, sweat, and tears, working long hours for very little money in many cases, all comes down to the outcomes you're trying to create. And guess what? That's what donors care about too. They don't so much care about the mechanics of how you do it. And so we want to communicate from the inside out. So if we go back to Apple's example, when they start with their why, they say, in everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo and thinking differently. Holy cow, that sounds cool. What's the next natural question? How do you do that? Right? So the person listening is going to want to read on, because the very idea that they're challenging the status quo and challenging people to think differently begs the question, well, how are you doing that? And so they then tell us. So we make sure our products are beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Now you notice they say products. So now they're not just a computer company, it's a lifestyle that they're selling. And so when they say, do you want to buy one? I don't know how many of you are in the room that are iPhone users, but I'm an iPhone user. I also have an iPad and an Apple Watch and an Apple laptop. That was the last one, was the hardest one to convert me to, just because of the price, because I've been a PC user all my life. But if you think about it, they have made their products so easy to integrate that it becomes a lifestyle. So why did I land up switching to all Apple products? Well, obviously the iPhone was easy to use, and I liked that. And for a long time, that was good enough. And then when iPads came out, my family gave one, and I liked reading online. But still, it was not linked until my family gave me an Apple Watch, and I realized, shoot, I can get email on my iWatch. I can get my text messages on my Apple Watch. I can send emails or voices, all kinds of things. It's like, that was really cool. I'm like, okay, now I need to go full on and commit. And I plunked down way too much money for an Apple laptop that I absolutely love. And so by beginning with their why, they are able to capture a market that is far larger than they could if they only spoke to being a computer company, which is how they started out. And the reason this works is not because people care about what you do, they want to know why you do it. And so the same thing applies in our nonprofit context. If we take this a step further, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you are an after-school program or a literacy program that provides remedial reading and one-on-one support for children who have learning disabilities. So if you started with your why would go something like this. We believe every child deserves a quality education. Now, when you say that to a donor, the first thing the donor is going to ask themselves is, hey, do I believe that too? And I don't think there's a person alive that would say they don't believe that a child deserves a quality education. So now, in one sentence, you have hooked them and shown to them, hey, donor, your values align with ours 100%. In sales, we call this building trust with a prospect, right? So the faster you build trust, the quicker you're going to get to close the sale. Or in this case, the faster you build trust, the quicker you're going to get to a yes, right? Now we get to how we do it. We help children with learning disabilities learn to read. Now you notice I didn't say anything about working with low-income children. I didn't say anything about how we do it, pairing reading buddies into 50 different schools to go read with kids one-on-one for an hour a day, 5 days a week. All of that is mechanics, right? And the donor doesn't really care about the mechanics. What they care about is the outcome. And so when we frame our stories in this way, by starting with the why, telling them the general how in the simplest way possible, the what becomes, what do we want you to do, donor? And notice the way we phrase that. Will you say yes to making a difference in the life of a child? I don't ask them to donate now, right? I'm asking them, will you say yes to making a difference in the life of a child? Now, the reason we use that is donor psychology, right? It's all about what the donor can do for the beneficiary. You're not asking them to support your work so you can help the child. You're asking the donor to help the beneficiary directly. And so when you put a fundraising proposition to a donor that's worded in this way, in a sense, there's a little bit of um, there's a lot of psychology in there, because if a donor doesn't click that button, they're saying no, right? So you're basically daring the donor to say no. And which donor is going to want to say, I don't want to make a difference in the life of a child? Even people who don't care for children, don't have children themselves, they all understand the value of investing in kids. And so if you don't remember anything else about this workshop today, I want you to make a commitment to stop talking about what you do and how you do it, and start talking about your why, because that's what drives people to give. Now, I'm going to take this one step further and ask you to think about how you would answer these questions for yourself. You know, as you look through the story of your life, there are going to be stories that jump out of you that never fade in your memory. And I'm going to use my own life as an example. So when I was a child, I grew up in a mixed income neighborhood in Jamaica. I would say our parents were solidly lower middle income. My dad was a small business owner, but barely struggled to survive each year. There were times when we did not have enough money to have quality food at every meal. It was just starches, you know. We didn't starve and we didn't feel poor, but by American standards, we would have been poor. But in the neighborhood that we grew up in, we were rich by comparison to others. See, our neighbors all grew up in homes that primarily were single moms, working as domestic helpers, earning very little, relying on public transportation. Some of them lived in tin shacks with dirt floors. Others lived in, wooden shacks with concrete floors, which was an upgrade. But here's the cool thing. My parents never kept us away from our neighbors. As kids, we grew up as if, we all did live on the same street. And so one thing I learned really early as a child is life isn't fair. How come my circumstances were different? Because my parents could afford a car, and it meant we didn't spend 6 hours a day on the road waiting for unreliable transportation. It meant they could afford to send me to a better school where we only had 20 kids in a class with one teacher. And we actually had books and crayons and desks, where the kids that in our neighborhood, many of them went to the public school where there were 60, 70 kids in a class without proper desks, books, and one teacher. And so my privilege was very apparent to me, and my parents reinforced that. And my father always used to say, to whom much, much is given. And one second story that is linked to that is that my dad was very active in the Lions Club. And we used to raise money to provide cataract surgery for people who couldn't afford it. And the primary way we did that was to raffle a Mercedes-Benz every year. So every Saturday for about 8 months, my dad would hook up the Mercedes-Benz on a trailer to his pickup truck, and then throw a battalion of us in the back, and we would go out to the busiest shopping plaza with raffle tickets in one hand and a White Cane Week can in the other, so that if we asked people to give us money for the surgery and they said no, we could then hit them with a raffle ticket. And we were a competitive bunch. So going out this Saturday, I took up my usual position outside the biggest department store. It was very popular. And to my surprise, a beggar came and sat across from me, and he put a serious dent in my business. And those of you who've heard me before know I'm far from shy. And somehow I managed to restrain from saying anything to this man until the end of the day. And my dad came and said, "Hey, Rachel, it's time to go." And I said, "Just a minute, Dad." And I went over to the beggar and I said to him, "Sir, would you like to give a donation to help the blind?" And my father stood in absolute horror and said, "How can you beg a beggar? Come on, it's time to go." And before I left, the beggar dropped a few coins in my can. Now at 12 years old, I certainly didn't understand the full significance of that event. At that point in my life, it was just absolutely joyful to prove my father wrong. But as I matured, I realized something, that none of us has so little that we have nothing to give. It's often a question of whether we are invited. I'm going to say that again. None of us ever has so little to give that it's often a case that we are not invited. So when we choose not to ask people to support the work that you're doing, we are making a decision we don't have any right to make. And after 15 years working for the Archdiocese of Miami in both a volunteer and paid capacity, I can tell you, the communities that have the least are the most generous in terms of what they give as a percentage of their income. So those are two stories that stood out in my youth and early adulthood. And it helped me to find my why. I wanted to go work with nonprofits from the minute I went to university. And my father said to me, "I'm not paying my hard-earned US dollars to give you a career to make you dependent on some man for the rest of your life. Study something sensible." So I did what every daughter does, right? I was a good girl. I figured, well, I'm not paying, so I can't choose. And I got a degree in IT and went to work in the manufacturing sector, where I spent 10 years. And I was very proficient and won all kinds of awards, but I wasn't fulfilled because I wasn't living my why. And in 2001, I had the opportunity to switch gears and go to the nonprofit sector. And that is where I have flourished, because it was where I am born to be. And so if I were to answer this question from my point of view on a personal level, My why is to help everybody I meet find their purpose and use their talents to change the world. So my job is to help everyone I meet find their purpose and use their talents to change the world. Now you'll notice I never said anything about fundraising in that why. That's the how. How do I do it? I teach nonprofits how to tell their stories in a way that attracts donors so they can fully fund their mission, right? And what do I want you to do? I want you to become the best fundraisers ever so that the next crisis that comes, because we know there are more in store for all of us, you're prepared to not only weather the storm, but thrive. Why did I tell you this on a personal level? This course teaches you to tell your why on an organizational level. But I want each of you to think about your personal why and go through this same exercise. Figure out what are the stories of your life that stick with you, that if somebody asked you to tell 3 stories about your life, what 3 would they be? Because in those stories is your why. And when we are working on our why, there is nothing that's too difficult to do. We can never get discouraged because we know that living our why is as important as eating, sleeping, and breathing, right? So I often hear from people when I teach, oh my gosh, Rachel, you're so inspiring. And I don't take any credit for that, absolutely none. It's simply a matter that I was fortunate that very early in life, I had experiences that helped me figure out my purpose, and I'm living it. And I want that for each of you, because being in the nonprofit sector is not easy. And unless you love it, you will never be able to convince a donor that they should love it too, right? And so when you look at people and you listen to the people who are the most inspiring, whether it's Steve Jobs or whoever, it's always comes down to this: they found their why. And when you know what your why is, and you work with an organization and their why also aligns with yours, that's where the magic happens. All right, I hope I haven't put any of you to sleep yet. So start with your why and finish with your why too, right? Both your personal why and your organizational why. Now, how do we compel people to act? What I'm going to teach you here is a simple framework that is going to seem a little bit different from the framework that you might have been accustomed to in developing what we call in nonprofit speak a case for support. A case for support is nothing more than making the case of why somebody should invest in your organization, whether it's a foundation or an individual or a corporation or anybody you can imagine. Many times we have an internal case for support that has lots of information about your vision, mission, values, your history, your key staff members, the programs that you do. In this case, I'm going to share with you more of what I would call a fundraising proposition. So it's an external facing case for support, right? The internal one has everything you need to write a grant, in very mechanical, logical, internal ways. But when we talk to donors, it has to have a different feel to it. And so if we want to compel people to act, we've got to figure out how to talk to them in ways that they understand. So this is a simple framework that I learned from one of fundraising's best, Tom Ahern. If you have never met Tom Ahern, you will want to at least read every book he's ever written. That's how I learned a lot of what I learned. He's also funny as heck. So I had the good fortune of taking a course with him recently on donor psychology out of the Institute of Fundraising in the UK. And I thought he was funny in his books, but he's even funnier in action. But basically, when we want to create a compelling case for support or fundraising proposition to share with our donors, there are 4 components. The first is the vision. No, this is not the vision statement for your nonprofit. The vision in this context is, what kind of world would we need to bring about so that we no longer need to exist? Let's think about that. What would the world look like in a world where we no longer need to exist. The second is the enemy or the obstacle. What prevents that vision from becoming a reality? Now, there may be many things. And when you go through this brainstorm session, I want you to jot them all down, every obstacle you can think of, right? That stands in the way. But we really have to condense it into a pretty concise statement, which I'll help you do. The third, who's the hero? In other words, who holds the power to bringing about this vision? What's it going to take? And lastly, who are the recipients that will benefit if we are successful in our mission? So going back to my example of literacy program for children with disabilities, if I was to write down a vision for what a world in Toledo would look like where we don't need those kinds of services, it would be this. Every child in Toledo has access to a quality education, right? So the reason many of our nonprofits that are in this space exist is because the traditional school system leaves kids behind, right? Maybe kids are in schools that are under-resourced. Maybe kids are, in schools that don't care about the exceptions. They only do the minimum that's legally required, and they'd rather just cater to the lowest common denominator, right? So in this case, the enemy or the obstacle would be, for example, families in low-income communities do not have access to good schools, right? So that's a simple way of saying lots of complicated things. If we were to dive behind that simple statement, some of the things we would discover are, and I say this as a former teacher, there are structural injustices in our country that are designed to keep certain people illiterate, right? And if you look at the funding models for how we fund our schools, schools in more affluent communities get more money because a lot of their funds come from the tax base of the community they're in. Whereas in low-income communities, they get less money because there's less of a tax base there. When in actual fact, it costs more money to educate a child that is growing up in a low-income community than it does to educate a child in an affluent community. And there are lots of reasons for that. It could be that, children in low-income communities often have parents that are single-parent households where the parents are working 2, 3, 4 jobs to make ends meet. So they're not physically present in the home as much, so they can't do as much homework help. Perhaps the parents themselves are not terribly educated, and so they can't provide that academic support that folks like you and me can provide to our kids. In addition to that, children in more affluent households are more likely to do things like take vacations. They're more likely to have internet access. They're more likely to have games and educational resources in their home, books, all kinds of things that mean that they have more background knowledge on which a teacher can build, because that's one of the building blocks of learning, activating background knowledge of kids so that you can connect the new content to what they already know, and that helps them to learn faster. So all of this is very technical, and yes, it's all true. If any of you have been involved in education, you know that there are lots of reasons and structural reasons for why this exists. But a donor is not going to be able to dive into that. And apart from that, you don't know the politics of your donor. So you don't want to speak to things in a political way so that you alienate people because you've used language that is not in their comfort zone or that they disagree with. And so what we do is we stick to the facts. Families in low-income communities do not have access to good schools, and that's the enemy that we're trying to defeat. Now, who's the hero? This is where you want to paint a picture of somebody that is compassionate, somebody that wants to right wrongs, and you paint the picture in a way that the donor wants to identify with the hero in your story and say, I want to be one of the heroes too, right? So you're basically speaking to people's best versions of themselves, or what they believe to be the best versions of themselves. So when we characterize them as compassionate people fighting to provide academic support so no child is left behind, the very word compassion says, oh, I'm compassionate. I could be a part of this, right? And then no child left behind is something that is not divisive. Of course, I realize we might need to change the wording of this, but because there was an initiative by President Bush that had a no child left behind policy that people may have strong opinions about. But frame it in a way that there's no way it could be construed as a political statement, right? Basically, we're just compassionate people fighting to make sure that every child has the academic support they need to succeed. And then finally, who are the recipients? You know, and I will confess right now, I have absolutely no idea how many children in the state of Ohio have learning disabilities. So this 1 in 6 is just for illustrative purposes only. So if you're in a literacy group or an after-school program and you know the real statistic, please don't call me out and beat me up. This was just for illustration. But you're basically painting a picture of how many neighbors in the community are affected by this. So I need to hear from all of you now. I've shared a lot with you. Does this make sense? Anybody want to tell me? How many in the chat? Let's blow up the chat. Does this model make sense? Give me a yes, yes, or what the heck are you thinking, Rachel? All right, I'm seeing from Rosanna and Kate and Tiffany and Jessie, Natalie. All right, I'm on the right track and you're all awake. Woot, woot. Give yourself a hand. Yeah. And I think it will make sense to your donors too. And I want to caution to you, this is kind of out of the box thinking. You know, if you're not the executive director or the last person who makes the call on the type of content you share, this might be a stretch, but it's where we need to push people to do it. And so if you get a little resistance when you use this approach, I would suggest you propose an A/B test in your appeals where you send half the group this version of what you're creating and the other half the traditional version that the executive director wants you to use, and then measure the donations that come in, because the data is going to tell you the story. So knowing that we're on the right track, we've gone through this exercise of creating a framework with the vision, the enemy, the hero, and the recipients. What does that look like in a call to action? It looks something like this. 1 in 6 children in Toledo has a learning disability. Today, with your help, we can give them the academic support they need to read on grade level. You notice I didn't say no child gets left behind. So the no child left behind is in our internal document that we're using to frame this compelling call to action for our donors, right? And you notice I didn't follow up with a donate. The call to action was, I want to help a child learn to read. Why? Because if I'm a donor reading this and I don't click that button, I'm going to think, gosh, I must be a real loser if I don't want to help a child learn to read. I mean, that is like connecting the call to action of we need you to support children to the people who are benefiting. So by framing it this way, we are forcing the donor to make a choice between saying yes to a child or saying no to a child. Whereas when we use the word donate, we're forcing them to make a choice between giving you money and not giving you money. So the more you connect them to the people that you're serving, the more likely it's going to be that they're going to say yes. Why does all of this matter? I don't know if any of you have ever read Roger Carver's book, The Leaky Bucket, but if you haven't, it's a pretty good book to read. But the premise is this. Most nonprofits stink at donor retention. The average donor retention rate around the country is 40%. That means 4 out of 10 donors will make a second gift. Or another way of framing that is the attrition is 60%, meaning 6 out of 10 donors will never give you a second gift. And 99.9% of that comes down to poor stewardship, that we aren't telling good stories about impact. We are not taking the time to build relationships with donors. And so the biggest thing you can do to build relationships with donors is to tell good stories, right? Now, why does it matter? The shortest path to raising more money next year than you did this year is to increase your donor retention rate, right? So if you think about it, I don't know how many of you have come from a sales background, but the cost of acquiring a customer, and in this case, our customers are donors, is 7 times more than the cost of retaining a donor or a customer. So if you have to go look and find a new customer, it's going to cost you 7 times the amount that would cost you to go to an existing customer and say, hey, would you like to buy some more, right? And the same thing is true in the nonprofit world. And so if you follow the work of giants like Penelope Burke and Dr. Adrian Sargent, they tell you that if you increase your donor retention rate by 10 percentage points, that is going to double the lifetime value of your donor file. I'm going to say that again and tell you what it means in real English, right? So if you increase your donor retention rate by 10 percentage points, you double the lifetime value of your donor file. So in real world, what does that mean? If you have a donor retention rate of 40%, and let's say you have 100 donors that gave you $100,000, right? Only 40% of those donors are going to stick with you from one year to the next. But if you can make that jump to 50%, then you're going to raise $200,000 from those same donors, right? So when we say double the lifetime value of your file, what we're saying is the group of donors that you have right now, if you can increase their retention rate and retain 5 of them or 50% of them instead of 40%, you're going to double the amount of money they give you. So I think that is the most important takeaway I have for you on this, that the reason you need to tell good stories is when you tell good stories, your bucket won't leak so much. So what I'd like to do now is I want each of you to take a piece of paper, and I want you to create this chart with a vision, obstacle, hero, and recipient. And by the way, this is your homework, so you don't have to do this all now. And Nicole is going to email you the slides along with a spreadsheet, not a spreadsheet, a worksheet that you can use to help you figure this out for yourself. But basically, just a quick back of the napkin exercise. If you were to look at your organization's mission, what would the world look like if your organization no longer needed to exist? Now, for some of you, this might be difficult, right? You might be a library, and you're thinking, well, libraries will always need to exist. So you have to think a little bit outside the box. The reason libraries need to exist is because none of us, or many of us, can't afford to purchase books, right? So libraries are there to make books accessible to everybody, and not just books, CDs, movies, media. So what would it look like to bring about a world where everybody earned sufficient money that they could purchase what they need without having to turn to a public resource? Now, I'm not saying that's ideal. I'm a big believer in libraries. My grandmother was a librarian, right? And I think there are a lot of benefits to libraries that go far beyond being able to check in and out resources. But just picture it as close to that abstract as you can. The obstacle, what is the main thing that is preventing that vision from becoming a reality? Heroes. Who could help you? Who can you bring along? What kind of adjectives would you use to describe the people that support your work now? Are they compassionate? Are they angry? Are they hopeful? So think about who your heroes are, and then the beneficiaries that are the recipients. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to do this. So right now it is 10:39. So we are going to take 10 minutes to do this. Actually, I think 10 minutes might be a little too long. Let me do 5 minutes. 5 minutes to do this. So we'll restart at 10:45. I'm going to ask those of you who would like to share share what you wrote with all of us so we can see how you're unpacking all of this. And then we'll take a break at the top of the hour. So I'm going to pause and leave this on the screen for all of you. And I will be back in 5 minutes. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them in the chat. I'll be happy to answer. So if you're struggling, feel free to type your question in the chat and I can help you get through it. We've got about 2 minutes left. So once you finish, if you type in "I'm done" in the chat, we'll get an idea of whether you need more time or not. I feel like I should be Alex Trebek now. Do, 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 do.
You can build that in for the next session if you want, sound effects, and we'll have a whole light show and everything. We'll just do it up.
Yes, yes. All right, we're seeing lots of people that say they're done. And at least this is just to get the noodles shaken out, you know. You'll have lots of time to refine this between now and the next class 2 weeks from now. So I'd like to ask some of you who would like to share. If you'd like to share, please just unmute yourself and tell us what was the vision, obstacle, hero, and recipient that you came up with for your organization.
Share mine, if that's helpful. Okay, so my vision for Tutor Smart in a world where we do not need to exist is every child has the tools and supports to achieve their academic potential. There are a lot of obstacles to that. Poverty, inequity, lack of access to resources, parental education levels, pretty much all the things. The hero would be passionate people willing to engage with children, to lift, model, and support a wide range of opportunities and change systems. And then the recipients would be children across the community and really eventually the world.
Excellent, excellent. So I love the way you've broken that down. One thing I would suggest you do with the hero, you want to make it personal to the donor, almost as if you're holding up a mirror to them to say, "Ooh, that's me," right? So when we talk about people that are willing to support and all with as much language as we put around that, you know, they can get lost in the details and say, well, I'm not sure I would know how to support a child that has a disability, you know? So you want to make it more about who the donor is as a person. They're generous, they're compassionate, they're friends. If you want to talk about friends, you know, generous, compassionate friends like you who care about kids, right? So just by holding up a mirror to the ideal donor, you'll be able to help others recognize themselves in the hero of that story. Just say, gee, I'm one of those people, I should get involved in this too, right? But well done, and thank you for all your work. I'm a special mommy, and I'm very grateful for organizations like yours. My son's on a ventilator, completely wheelchair bound and pretty much bed bound, but he is in college and has a year to go before he graduates with a bachelor's. And none of that would have happened without the support that he received from his school and the myriad of people that helped us. So your work matters. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else want to share?
I could share, but I think mine is sort of off base. I'm the volunteer business development coordinator at Family House. For those that don't know, we're a shelter that house homeless families in Toledo. So what the world would look like if they didn't need our organization would be, there would be an end to homelessness. So
Let me
that's
stop you
very
there.
broad.
Let me stop you there. That's the problem, is homelessness, right? So the vision is something positive. Every human being has shelter and the ability to live with dignity, right? So the vision of your world is not about the negative, it's about the positive. So flip your script, right? The enemy is where you're going to put the negative. So the enemy is that the enemy then becomes, let me hear what you came up with for the enemy.
Well, the obstacle is the lack of affordable housing inventory.
Excellent. But I would drop the word inventory, the lack of affordable housing, because inventory is a word that we would use as kind of jargon that a donor might not use, but absolutely the rest of it is spot on.
And then, although it wouldn't be our donors that would be the hero to tackle the larger problem, the hero would be real estate investors, having those affordable housing available for the community. So it's sort of as off track as to helping our organization, but helping the cause as a whole.
You're absolutely right. The challenge with this is we have to help donors see their role in the story, right? So
Right.
From an internal case for support, that is absolutely right. There's lots of real estate investors, town planning councils, you know, people like that have the ultimate control. But there are things that individual donors can do to help people who are homeless overcome obstacles, right? So in this case, your hero would be somebody like compassionate people who believe every human being deserves to live with dignity. Remember, this is the portion where you're holding up a mirror to the donor to say, is this you? Right? So when you look at your hero, whatever you write in there, ask yourself the question, could I say that to a donor and say, is this you? So if you were to say compassionate people who believe every human being deserves to live with dignity and ask me, is that you? I'm like, oh, heck yeah. Right?
Okay.
So that'll help you there, because the larger issue, even though it is going to address the structural causes, is outside the scope of what the donor has the power to change, right?
Yes.
That belongs in the grant proposals that you write for advocacy.
Yes. And then the recipient would be those that are experiencing homelessness.
Yes, but put a quantity on it, you know, like if you have a statistic for homelessness in Toledo specifically, or whichever community you serve, let's use that, you know,
Okay.
like 1 in 6, and focus on the one, right? So you notice that when we talk about statistics, we tend to talk on the macro level. You know, there are 10,000 homeless people in the city of Toledo. When you use big numbers like that, a donor can get discouraged and think, well, shoot, what's my $25 going to be able to do when the problem is so big, right? So you want to personalize it. And if you can get a statistic like 1 in X number, it's going to be easier to help the donor see they can help that one, right?
Yes. Yep. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for sharing, Mandy. You know, we're all learning, and I encourage you, there are no right or wrong answers. I'm just giving you things I know that work from my experience. Doesn't mean they're always right. But when we share out like this with each other, that's what's going to help us all learn. And so in the next class, what I'm going to ask you all to do is to come back with your refined versions so we can share out like this and see how we frame things, because then we'll all be able to grow together. So thank you to brave souls that volunteered to share their stories today, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with. And if you really have time and want to do an interesting exercise, a good way to do it is to ask your teams and your executive director, your boards, to complete this exercise and guide them through it just the way I've guided you, because it can be an eye-opening experience for them, you know? All right.
Hey, Rachel, we do have a question that might be good to address right now.
All right.
What if, Amy would like to know if your organization is inherently positive, like theater or music. How do you frame your story when the work you do isn't necessarily solving those kind of big problems?
That's a great question. And it is solving a problem, you know, Amy. If you think about it, I'm a child of the theater, so I'm a big arts lover. As a child of the theater, I spent probably 15 years in the theater, and that's what has equipped me to be a really powerful speaker and presenter, because I had to be on the stage and hone my craft as a youngster, and it's a lot harder to do it when you get older. I look at my peers that didn't grow up in the theater, and yeah, many of them are a lot smarter than I am. But they don't have that comfort on the stage because they haven't had the practice, and that's why groups like Toastmasters exist. The other side of it is it doesn't have to be a problem so much as painting a picture for how much your organization enriches the world. So, you know, I like to say, even especially at a time like this, a lot of arts organizations are really struggling, because many of them have boards or even leadership teams that feel like this is not the time to be asking arts donors for money when there are food banks that need help or people are getting evicted. That's not so. The donors that give to you still care about you, you know? And I look at it from this point of view. Can you imagine a world without color? Can you imagine a world without music? Can you imagine a world without dance? That's not a world that I would want to live in, or any of you. And if you think about it, the arts help us to cope with the stresses of life. I'm a quilter, and I would tell you, I would have lost my ever-loving mind if I didn't have quilting during COVID-19. I am locked up in my house. I am single, live alone, except for when my daughter was home, which was a whole nother can of worms when your adult children come home because college is closed, right? And I know that because I have quilting and art and music, I'm in a much better place mentally than a lot of my friends that don't have that creative side, And so your vision would be a world in which everyone has the opportunity to express themselves creatively. So it's not about the art, it's about what art can do for people, what music can do for people. Um, I went through a divorce last year, which was a long time coming, and I was the one that initiated it. And I'll tell you what gave me the courage to finally step out into the deep, into the scary unknown was music. I started to use music to process the emotions that I had repressed for so long and to process the fear that I was feeling. And that's what gave me the courage. And I have a beautiful life now, and I'm so happy. And I think none of that would have been possible without music. It's why music is used for trauma therapy. It's why art is used for trauma therapy. So I would suggest you broaden your aperture to make it not about the art itself, but what art can do for people, whether it's music, dance, theater, whatever it is. Does that make sense? All right. So we are running up to a good place to take a break. I know that you are all zooming from one meeting to the next, and I don't know about yours, but my Apple Watch is telling me, get up, sister, it's time to stand up. I'm sure yours is telling you the same thing. So let's take a break, and we are going to get started again. Let's take a 7-minute break. So we'll start back again at 11:05.
Right. See you then.
See you then. All right, we are right at 11:05. So welcome back. Now we're going to dive in to the second half. And before I do, I think it was Danielle posted a comment in the chat to me privately that I wanted to share with all of you about the vision. And she said, you know, a vision of having nobody with a disability seems like it's not going to work. And you're absolutely right, Danielle. So the vision isn't a world where there are no people with disabilities. The vision would be a world where everyone that has a disability has the resources they need to live with dignity, right? So, or to achieve their full potential, something like that. Because we can't, for the vision, we have to have things that are within our control. And so what's within our control is not to have people born without disabilities, but it is within our control to be able to provide the support services they need so that both they and their families can thrive. You know, I hope that makes sense. All right, so ready for the second half? Shake it off, shake it off. We're ready. The next thing is, how do we make the right ask? So we've learned that we need to start with a why, because that's what people are connecting with. We've learned how to use a vision, an enemy or obstacle, the hero and the recipient to create a very compelling call to action that people are likely to respond to. So now we have to figure out what's the right ask. And so in order to make the right ask, you have to know your donors really well. And this is where segmentation is your friend. So segmentation is a process of dividing people into groups, small groups or larger groups, where they all share common characteristics so that you can speak to them in a way that feels very personal to them. So to give you an example of that, when I was at Catholic Charities, we had 14 different programs that were spread across 3 counties. Everything from HIV to refugee resettlement to early Head Start to drug treatment, elderly care, you name it. And so I learned this the hard way. This is one of my epic fail movements, things you learn the hard way. When I first became their development director, I was a self-taught learner and very idealistic. I guess you could say is a good way to describe it, because I never understood how people can do anything other than love other humans, in the sense that, you know, I wouldn't be offended by helping somebody who had HIV. Similarly, I believe every refugee needs to be resettled. And like many people, I assumed that most people shared my broad point of view of loving everybody, but they weren't raised by Jennifer Stevenson. So I learned the first year, I had a wonderful story about an HIV positive man that we had helped. And in December 1st is always World AIDS Day. And since it was coinciding with the launch of our appeal, I decided I would tell that story in our year-end appeal. And I got a few nasty grams back from people who thought that the church should not be helping people who are HIV positive because their own immoral behavior led to that diagnosis, and all kinds of ignorance, you know. This was probably 25 years ago, so lots of time has passed. But the fact is that there are people out there that don't share our worldview, and you know, so we have to be careful how we reach out to them. And so what I ended up doing after learning that lesson, after he told me he would never ever give Catholic Charities another dime, and I was thinking to myself, well, good, we don't need your money, you know. But it also brought home the fact that I needed to be more intentional about how I spoke with folks. And so what I did then was I created 15 different lists, 14 of them, one for each program, and a 15th for people that didn't support a particular program. And so every year I had 15 different year-end appeals. If I was writing to people who had given to the HIV program, I used an HIV story. If I was writing to somebody that had contributed to refugee resettlement, I told a refugee story. That's what segmentation does for you. It allows you to personalize communications to donors so that you can communicate with them and tell them stories that would be of interest to them. That brings me to the second point. Making the right ask is about figuring out what your donors care about, and then what aspects of your work align with what they care about. So I'll tell you an interesting story about this. My brother's a Catholic priest in Kingston, Jamaica, and we have a school for 1,000 children from desperate poverty. Jamaica's an on-your-own society, so there's no Medicare, there's no food stamps, nothing like that. You don't have food banks giving out food, none of that. And so when he first went there, one of the problems we noticed was about 60% of the kids had learning delays, but not necessarily learning disabilities, right? For many of them, they just had not had access to quality preschool. And so they started first grade with no phonemic awareness or anything. So we asked the teachers what we could do to intervene. And we chose the 200 slowest learners. And we knew that hunger was their daily bread. And so we knew that their parents would agree to send them to school early if we could start a breakfast feeding program, and then during the breakfast, pay the teachers to provide supplemental instruction, right? Brilliant idea, I thought. And at the time, we didn't have too many donors with the capacity to fund something like that. And so I approached this donor. He was quite a character. He passed away last September. But he was a man who owned casinos all over the world. And I knew he cared about kids. And so I said to him, Ray, I need your help. And I outlined the project, and the man shot me down in flames. And he said, that's not for me. He said, kids don't need more instruction, they need more fun. And I'm thinking, how could this guy not get that kids with empty bellies can't learn? I mean, internally, that's what I'm thinking. And I always say to folks, thank God there's no thought bubble above my head, or I'd be dead by now. But somehow I mustered the courage to say to him, that's a surprise. Can you help me unpack that? Because I didn't peg you for not being interested in a project. I got that all wrong. So he told me the story of growing up in Pittsburgh, Catholic family. He was the youngest of 5, and his father died when he was very young. And in his own words, I was the hellraiser of the family. And his poor mother, having been a stay-at-home mom, had to go out to work and deal with 5 kids all at the same time with no family around her. And she found the Boys and Girls Club and quickly signed Ray up for that. And he fell in love with basketball. And he lived to go to the Boys and Girls Club every day after school so he could play basketball. And a funny thing happened because his coaches required him to do well in school in order to participate in basketball. So suddenly he started doing his work in school. He started paying more attention. He wasn't being referred to the principal's office for behavior infractions every day because he had one single focus. I want to play basketball, and I know that I need to do what I need to do to get it done. He said, so kids don't need more instruction, they need more fun. I said, okay, I could understand that. And I said to him, how about I go back and talk to the principal about this and then come back to you in a little while? And he said, sure. So I went to the principal and I said, Miss White, we have a problem here. This donor is not interested in this project, but we need to do it. I'm thinking, would it be possible for us to design a sports program after school that provided nutritious snacks for the kids and homework instruction so that they could play, and we roll it all into one? She said, oh, absolutely. I'm like, cool. Called him back. I said, Ray, I want to thank you for opening our eyes to something that we didn't see right in front of us. What am I doing? Stroking his ego, right? I said to him, you were absolutely right. We went back to the principal, and here's another project that they really need help funding. The man gave me $18,000 a year, and his widow continues to do it for over 12 years because he said nobody ever listened to him before. And that every month he wrote that check of $1,500 to send it to me, thought about his dear mother, who, if it wasn't for the wisdom of enrolling him in the basketball program, he would have been a degenerate instead of a successful multimillionaire, right? Why do I tell you this story? I tell you this story because once I figured out what his interest was, which was athletics and fun, it allowed me to go back and create a project that would be of interest to him, that accomplished the same goals that we were looking to accomplish in slightly different ways. And the donor was fully invested because, as he told me every time he saw me, you're still the only people that ever listened to me. And we built such a relationship with him that when he passed, just before he passed, his widow called me and said, can you get your brother up here by tomorrow? Because Ray's not expected to make it more than 24 hours. So my brother came at 11 o'clock at night, and I drove him down to Jackson in Miami, and we gave him last rites. And my brother said, Ray, I'm coming back from Mass tomorrow, so don't check out yet. And the man was unconscious, and we did Mass in his hospital room the next day. And I kid you not, as soon as it came time for the Eucharist, he opened his eyes, nodded, got a little tiny piece, and then went back to sleep and died a couple of days later. But that's the magic that happens when you can make the right ask of a donor and build that kind of relationship with them where you can say, hey, help me unpack that. I didn't get that right, So the segmentation helps in the sense that when people give you money, if you know what program they're giving to or what page they came in when they click donate, you can get a general idea of interest. But the real money comes when you get to know your donors one-on-one. Next thing you have to figure out is, what kind of ask are you going to make of them? Is it going to be a one-time ask, or is it going to be a recurring ask? So when you're looking at your donors, you want to see, are there any donors that have given you $100 or less to 3 or more campaigns, consecutive campaigns? And if it's in a given year, even better. Anybody that's given to 3 consecutive campaigns, especially in a 12-month period, is a prime monthly giving prospect. It's not a big stretch to ask them to give you 9 more gifts if they've already given you 3. So if somebody's giving you $100 a month, you ask them for a gift of about a third of that every month. So maybe $35 a month, right? Or if they give you $50, ask them for a $20 gift every month. But that's how you peg them. If they're on the smaller side donors and you look at the high frequency, then you want to make a recurring gift ask from them. And then on the one-time ask, you'll have some of the larger donors or even people that just haven't given you more very often. They give sporadically. The fourth thing in terms of making the right ask. I don't know if you've ever seen those direct mail pieces from Food for the Poor or some of those large organizations. They will have a tear-off coupon and it will say, you know, yes, I would like to give, and they have a suggested gift amount, right? And they call that a gift array. So it's always higher than you gave the last time. So if you gave $100, then they might say your gift of $125 or $175 or $250 does X. Most donors are going to choose the middle dollar amount, right? They're not going to choose the lowest one. And since the lowest one is already more than they gave you the last time, that's a great way to score what we call donor upgrades, where donors are giving you more money. So as you think about making the ask, when you use your messaging, are you using gift arrays? You know, that can be a really powerful way of getting things right. All right, so far so good? Sweet. So let's look at creating consistent campaigns now. What does that look like? So in a consistent campaign, you want to make sure you're telling the right story. So what is the right story? I mean, we all have tons of different stories that we could use to share with people. One thing you want to do when you're talking about individual donors is make sure you're packing an emotional punch, right? So you want to talk about a story that is going to resonate with people's emotions. So one way to think about that is when you're in contact with the clients you serve, which story made you cry? If they can make you cry every day or cry at all after seeing this every day, that's the right story. You know, when we do this work every day, we get used to seeing things. And it's not that we're insensitive to it, but it's, you know how common it is, right? And so when that one person walks through the door, and there's always at least one, and they actually make you cry and go home and tell your family members, man, today was a rough day, that's the one you want to tell. You also want to tell a story that speaks to the transformative power of your work, right? So when you talk about this person's story and the growth and outcomes, you're weaving into that the little bit of the how of what you do, right? So the donor gets a picture of what it takes to get those outcomes. And so when you do all those things, you're going to make your work come alive, and it makes readers come alive too. So that's how you pick your right story. When you want to go tell it, you got to make sure you tell it in the right way too, right? So many times this is where we fall down, and we start talking about the work that we do, right? So we do this and we do that. It's not about what you do, it's about what the donor does. So you want to make sure they are the heroes in the story that have the power to bring about this change, because that's what's going to make them respond to it. So how do you do that? Well, you have to start with a structured and emotional narrative. You know, you begin with a setting like any story. So what was the backstory to the reason that person landed up in the position to begin with, right? That's what we're calling the setting. Move on to a crisis. What was the sudden event that triggered them coming to you for help, right? And then what did you do to resolve the problem? So those are the basic mechanics of what a good story needs. Now you need to weave the emotions in it. And it could be any emotions, positive or negative emotions, but where you put them matters. So you want to make sure that you're triggering negative emotions in the setting and crisis stages, right? So negative emotions would be things like anger or fear or sadness. But you want to load up the positive emotions in the intervention and resolution stages, because that's what's going to make the donor feel good and say, this story has a happy ending, because you want them to be in the business of creating happy endings, right? And then the last tip I'll share with you is throw out the institutional speak. It needs to be in a conversational tone. I want you to pretend that you're having a cup of tea or coffee with your friend. How would you tell that story? I used to do this when I was at Catholic Charities, record myself as if I'm telling a story to my mom. She is where I got my great storytelling skills from, by the way. And so before I wrote a word on the page, I would literally start the voice memo thing on my iPhone and just record myself as if I'm talking to mom and transcribe it, you know? And that can be a great way because it comes across as more heartfelt and genuine when you do it in that way. The next thing is, who do you tell your story to? So you want to tell it to donors, volunteers, supporters, businesses, and grant makers. But more importantly, it's not just any of those people, it's people who share your why.
Oh, the number.
So if you're telling your story to people who share your why, they're much more likely to give. So what does that look like for us? I will confess to you that I love animals when they belong to other people. I cannot abide the smell, the task of scoop and poop. And so owning an animal for me is a deal breaker. But I do love them when they belong to other people. And my children tell me, Mom, you're not a real animal lover if you can't scoop poop. And I'm like, okay, I'm a fair weather friend, definitely. But guess what? I earned that right? So when I see ads on TV for animal charities, and I don't know about you, but it seems like every time I turn on the news, the Humane Society or ASPCA has an ad on for animals. They make a very compelling story and a very compelling why, and they're a wonderful organization, but they're not on my donation list because they don't align so much with my why. My why, in terms of the people that I am most drawn to support, are children, and especially people with disabilities, because I'm a special needs mommy myself. So making sure that you're telling your story to people that align with your why is a big part of being successful in fundraising. And then finally, you have to tell your story at the right time. What does that look like? It means you have to have some kind of urgency that requires the donor to act right now, right? So when we're thinking about this, urgency does not mean, oh, we are $100,000 short of our year-end fundraising goal. That only shows that that's internal problems. So you're not going to project internal metrics or issues to the donor. What drives urgency is the need or the opportunity. So for example, if you have a matching gift donor that has contributed money for a campaign, the urgency is for the next 30 days, your gift will be matched dollar to dollar, right? Another way of creating urgency is to talk about the number of people you have on a waiting list. Right now, we have 100 children that need reading buddies, and we just don't have the funds to match them with a reading buddy, Again, so it's a problem the donor is capable of solving. And then basically we want to do it in a way that says, donor, if you don't step up, people are going to fall through the cracks. Real people. I'll tell you a funny story about this. We used to have this group in Broward. They renamed themselves. They were called Impact Broward. Now they're called South Florida Institute on Aging. But they match retirees with kids as reading tutors. And so they also provide mental health services for vets that are suffering PTSD and a number of other things. And their executive director was new at the time, and he signed up for a storytelling class that I was teaching for the Children's Services Council. And afterwards, he sent me an email. He's like, Rachel, I need your help. Can you edit this year-end appeal letter for me? And I looked at it, and it was a textbook case of institutional speak and storytelling done wrong. It didn't pass the U test, as Tom Ahern would say, meaning make it about you, donor. And Tom Ahern, if you've never read about his U test, Google it, the U test, Tom Ahern. But basically the U test means that you shouldn't have more than 1 square inch in your letter between U's, the word you, right? Because you're talking to the donor about what the donor can do. Anyway, I rewrote his letter and I sent it to him. And in the letter, I told a story of this little boy named Tommy, who was in kindergarten, and he kept getting thrown out of class every single day because he was so disruptive and he was driving his teacher nuts. And they wanted to put him on an IEP, for special needs kids. And then they had the reading buddy assigned to him. And each week she would meet with him an hour a day, and Tommy and Emily would read. And within the end of the school year, he was reading on grade level. He no longer disrupted the class, and he had a complete turnaround because Tommy's behavior was not ADD or anything medical. It was simply that he was embarrassed he couldn't read and didn't want the teacher to call on him. So when I sent it to Peter, he said, oh my gosh, Rachel, this is awesome, but I don't think my development team is going to go for this because it's so radically different from what they've tried before. I'm like, Peter, you're the CEO. This is the time to step up, man. If you want something different, you have to push the envelope. So I saw him at a cocktail party a few months later, and I said to him, so how'd it go? And he laughed. He said, you have us talking in the office because the finance team came to him with 3 envelopes and said, who's Tommy? And 3 donors had written checks to the organization saying, I want to help kids like Tommy. And so that's the power of a good story. In the way it was told, I said something simple to create urgency. I said, we have 100 Tommies on a waiting list, waiting for a reading buddy. All we need is you to make it happen. And that's what made people give. So we've talked about telling the story to the right people in the right way and the right time. Now, how do you get those darn stories? This is honestly the hardest part of the effort because especially if you're working for an organization that has a lot of programs, you can make it a job requirement for caseworkers and program directors to send you notes. It will never happen. It's always the 11th item on their top 10 to-do list. And I'll tell you, the easiest way to get it is to go into the trenches and ask them, can I shadow you for a day? And just listen and meet the clients. And as the clients leave, ask them, would you be willing to spend a few minutes talking with me so I could learn a little bit more about your story? I'm working on a really special project. I'm working on a project to help donors talk about the difference they make in lives of people like you. So they want to give us more money so we can help more people like you. 99% of those folks will tell you yes. And so there are ways that you can get stories from program directors, social workers, volunteers, and clients, but the very best way I've found is for you to just go spend a day in the life with your caseworkers. You can also find some in client follow-up. So, in the discharge notes of every client file, one of the things I advocated for at Catholic Charities was that we include a question that says, may we contact you from time to time to see how you're doing, right? And if they answered yes to that, then I would just go literally pull a few cases out of the old files, see who I could contact and start talking to people. And you'd be amazed the wonderful stories you can have there. When you look at case notes from existing clients, you can find stories there, although I'll say they usually come disguised. They'll come in a disguise that says 36-year-old female, 2 children, 14-year-old boy, 8-year-old girl, divorced, referred to domestic violence shelter, paid 1 month's rent, very clinical. And so again, you need to ask the social worker, is there a way you could connect me with this client for a quick conversation? And you can paint the story out of the conversation there. So I hope that's helpful because it's by far the most challenging part of the process. So far, so good? Give me a thumbs up. All right. Well, now for the fun part. So how do we put this all together? We started with a why. We talked about the framework for telling good stories and getting a clear call to action. We talked about segmentation and all those things. So how do you pull it all together? Well, the holy grail of good storytelling is to have consistent messaging across all the different channels that you use to tell your story. Whether it's a letter that gets sent in the mail as part of a direct mail campaign, whether it's a landing page on a website, Facebook or social media, or even email images. So when you're thinking about how you tell your story, it can be a little overwhelming when you think, oh my gosh, I got to tell my story across all these channels. So I'm going to share the last story I'll share with you today, which is about my grandmother. I mentioned her earlier. She was from Wales in the United Kingdom, lived in Jamaica 70 years and never became a Jamaican citizen. She was British to the end. And she had a very interesting thing that used to drive my mother absolutely bonkers. So when I came to college, there was no internet to tell you what a dinosaur I am, or at least it wasn't accessible to everybody. And so she would gather stories from the newspaper that she read every day in Jamaica, and she would cut them out and snip the newspaper and then send these huge things in envelopes. And they would arrive maybe a month later at college. And she would have all these notes scribbled in the margin, I thought you'd be interested in this because of. But it drove my mother nuts because she would begin snipping the paper before my mother even had a chance to read it, right? And so mom had to buy 2 papers every day, one for her to snip and one for the rest of the family to read. And one of the things that was interesting about her was that she was a very proper Welsh lady, you know, she thought we were being absolutely corrupted in this country. The fact that we spoke patois to our friends instead of the Queen's English, I mean, she was just a very big snob, which we found hilarious. And then we used to go to great lengths to irritate her. And her biggest pet peeve was people who made up words or spelled words incorrectly. And so I coined this phrase, snippetize, in her memory, because it captures two things. One is the process itself, and two, just her absolutely, she would have hated it, and I would have loved every minute of that. So what does it mean to snippetize your story? To snippetize your story means when you're telling your story across all these channels, they all have different word limits and formats. So start with the longest format, which is going to be your direct mail appeal. So when you're sending an appeal in the mail to someone, you have 2 pages, you know, or 1 page back and front, right? And so that's the longest form of the story that you're going to be able to tell. The next longest form is going to be an email. So what you have to do is, now emails shouldn't be more than 250 words, right? And so my secret to making it less time consuming is when I write the direct mail appeal letter, I go through and I eliminate every word that is not absolutely necessary. So if you have the word that anywhere, delete it. Doesn't need to be in a sentence, right? It's wasted real estate. Next thing, people like to skim as they read. So use headlines, right? And you ask yourself the question for each sentence that you have in that letter. If the reader did not read this sentence, would it make a difference in whether they took the call to action or not? So if the sentence is essential, meaning they need to read it to understand the context for the call to action, then make sure you find a way to bold it, italicize it, put it in a 1-sentence paragraph by themselves. Whatever you need to do, you're going to draw attention to that sentence. And you don't want long paragraphs, you know? This is not where the Queen's English works. Like my grandmother used to tell me, you can't have a paragraph with less than 5 sentences. You know, well, yeah, we live in America. We have 1-sentence paragraphs. But when you call out those key phrases or sentences that the reader absolutely at a minimum has to read in order to understand the call to action and say yes to it, you find a way to make them bold, italics, underlined, 1-sentence paragraph to draw the reader's eye visually to it. Now it becomes very easy to create your email because basically you're going to drop everything else that's not in that format, right? So if it's not bolded, italicized, underlined, or in a sentence by a paragraph by itself, it doesn't go in the email. So now it's easy, easy. Now you take that email and you have to make a Facebook post out of it, right? With Facebook, you have about maybe 30 words before you hit the read more link. So you have to figure out, of all of those things, what is the minimum you could tell the reader so that they would want to click read more? Create that fascination, right? And so that's what you do. Then you go to Twitter, you have 140 characters, right? And that's how I snippetize stories. So that's what snippetize means, work smarter, not harder. And if you do that, then this is going to become a much less overwhelming thing. And so I'm going to move into the final part of the presentation, which is a lookbook of examples of this whole storytelling experience done well. And some of them are old campaigns. So in this one, it's the Animal Rescue League Shelter and Wildlife Center. And there are 4 different versions of this campaign. The first one here is a magazine ad. The second image is a reply device that shows that readers or donors would fill out in order to send it. The third is a movie theater ad. Gosh, remember the days when we could go to the movies? I long for the day I could fall asleep at a movie again. And then the last one is a billboard. Now you'll notice a few key things that make this a very powerful campaign. Remember, this is a multi-channel campaign. You're going to talk to people on as many channels as you can, because gone are the days when we could send one letter and expect a donor to mail back a check, right? So you have to get people's attentions frequently. In fact, it's just like advertising. You usually have to, in ads, touch people 27 times before they take the action. Thank God it's not so many times in the nonprofit world, but it's 3 or 4 times usually. And so if you look at this, there's a consistency in the fonts that they're using, the call to action, but most importantly, the visual image. It's the same hound from one campaign to the next, right? Or a very similar looking hound. I think these are actually 2 campaigns that I have here. The other thing is they had a theme called Believe That You Can Make a Difference. And that theme was echoed on the reply device in the movie theater ad, and then different versions of it. But it has the same look and messaging, the red and black text, you know, things like that. Now, we're going to look at another campaign. This one was included a bus stop, another humane society. So a bus stop image as well as direct mail. And you'll notice the same thing again. It's the same dog in every single area, the same black dog. And so that leads to familiarity for people. And guess what? Believe You Can Make a Difference is echoed everywhere, right? Because that was the theme of their campaign. Now in this one, this is something called the Appalachia Service Project. And they help families, and they are a faith-based organization. But in their print newsletter, they had this cute little girl cuddling a puppy, it looks like. And notice that the top here, just under the front porch banner, is a quote from the family. I don't know what we'd do without ASP, right? And then when you look at their other communications, which is a printed letter that they're sending people, so this is an actual appeal, they're echoing the same words. I don't know what we'd do without ASP. They're using the same child in the same clothes, but this time she's surrounded by her family. And the same thing in the YouTube video. And so when you look at all of these, it gives you an idea of what that consistent imagery does to help you across channels. And then the last one here is the holiday giving campaign. This is an oldie but goodie from the American Red Cross. And you'll notice it's the same beautiful image of the volunteer and the little boy, and whether it's on their gift catalog, whether it's on the tablet or wherever. And so it's still the same message, and help save the day is their theme. So that's what we mean by consistent messaging, right? So I know I've shared a lot with you in a very short period of time, and I hope I haven't overwhelmed you, but it really does come down to these 4 things. Start with your why. Your why as an individual for the work that connects you to who you are and why you're drawn to the mission you serve. Because when you know your why as an individual and it aligns with the work that you're doing, that passion is going to come through in the way you tell your story, right? And again, as I said before, people always tell me, oh my gosh, Rachel, I could listen to you all day because you have wonderful stories, but it's only because I'm telling stories about things that I care about. If you asked me to tell you a story about politics, I would be probably the worst speaker you could hire, you know? So that authentic voice and passion starts with the why for you and the why for your organization. Second, make sure that you are providing a call to action that people feel compelled to take because it aligns with their vision, their values, and their best sense of who they are. Third, make sure you're making the right ask. You don't want to ask $1,000 donor for $10 or a $10 donor for $1,000. Neither will result in a good outcome. And lastly, go ahead and create compelling campaigns. You want to spend the money on good images and things like that. And so with all that said, I know I've done a lot of talking and I want to give you all a chance to ask questions. I'm going to open up the mic. So if you'd like to voice your question, please just unmute yourself, say your name and dive right in. Or if you prefer to ask it in the chat, feel free to chat it into the chat box.
We had a good one in the chat, Rachel. I don't know if you see this. It was Jill. Jill, do you want to unmute and ask, or we can just kind of read it out of there? I thought it was a great question. I can totally relate to this.
I'll read it out for Jill.
Okay.
So Jill says, hi, I have a question that flips the script for a second from somebody who's involved with a nonprofit to my personal experience as a donor. As a donor, when I receive appeals that give me a choice of dollar amounts and they always start higher than my last donation, I feel offended. Like they couldn't just be grateful for my $100 gift. Now they want 125. Am I the norm? You're always normal for yourself, Jill. Absolutely. It depends is the answer. You know, we all have our own little idiosyncrasies as a donor, and I'll tell you two of mine so that you don't feel like you're alone in this. One is I do a lot of speaking, and obviously I meet lots of cool people doing cool things, but a lot of them feel, even though I say it openly in my trainings, that I don't like to get email from people, automated emails from people that I have not opted into their content, right? You want to send me a personal email? Absolutely. But many people just take my email address and they add me to their newsletter list or their appeals list. And when they do that, it drives me nuts. And I tell you, it is the surest way to make sure you never get a dime from me. So that's one of my pet peeves. The other pet peeve I have as a donor is a totally generational thing as well, in that I don't like nonprofits to text me. I don't. Text for me, or I don't like for-profits to do it either. I feel like as an individual, every boundary we had has been invaded by the world. We get junk mail in our inboxes. We get spam phone calls all the time. Thank God I don't have a home phone anymore and I can block them on my mobile. But the texting is only for the people that are nearest and dearest to me, or people that I have obviously said, hey, it's okay to text me. So, you know, that's my idiosyncrasy. I work on a team of people that are younger than me, and they're like, oh my gosh, text makes it so easy. I love text. Don't pick up the phone and call me. So I say this all as a caveat for you are entitled to have your donor preferences, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. So if you feel offended, and don't feel guilty for feeling offended, because that's your right as a donor. Now, that I'm going to take off my personal donor hat and put on the nonprofit hat. At the end of the day, it comes down to a numbers game. The reason that nonprofits do that is that it works more times than it doesn't and scores the upgrade. So for every donor like you that feels that way and would be offended and risk not giving again, there are 100 more that will totally bite down on this, you know? Food for the Poor is a great example of this. And in just a full disclosure, my mother used to work for the organization when she was alive, and they fund a lot of my brother's work. They were founded by Jamaicans, and I'm very involved with them in the past, not so much now. But they're a fabulous nonprofit, and even as much as I know the good work they do, one of the things that drives me nuts is that if you give them $1 or an email address, you are going to have an appeal for money just about every other day in your inbox or every week in your mailbox. And, you know, some people will get offended by that and say they're wasting my money on, you know, sending these pieces of mail. But the truth is they send them in such volume that they're paying pennies for them. And if even a small percentage of people bite down and give, they've more than made enough money to cover the mailing, and it's bringing in revenue. So they do it because it works. Now, I've called them and emailed them and told them, don't call me, I'll call you. Don't waste your money asking me for money, because you're my first go-to when there's a crisis in the Caribbean or I want to do something like that. You know, so what I want to say is that every time you communicate with a donor, you run the risk of ticking people off. But as long as you're not doing that as often as you are delighting people and getting results, don't worry about ticking them off. And I'll tell you one last funny story. At Catholic Charities, I had this old curmudgeon and sent him a year-end appeal, and he sent me, it was a spring appeal, and he sent me a nasty note and said that he only likes to give his gift on December 15th every month, and he hates that I burned the agency's dollars to send him an appeal to something he's never going to give to, and he doesn't want a thank you letter because he would like his money to be given 100% to the poor, da 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 da. I mean, really ranted, and I'm thinking, God, looking at this, what the heck do I do? It's a lose-lose proposition, you know, because if I write to him and say, thank you for letting me know your preferences, he's going to be mad because I've burned more money sending him a letter to say, yes, we heard you loud and clear, right? So I ended up using humor with him. And I said to him, dear Mr. So-and-so, I just want you to know that your feedback was so important to me that I paid to send you this card out of my own pocket. You're that important, right? I have heard you loud and clear, and we appreciate your generosity, and I will make sure that from now on, you only receive your appeal on the first week of December, so you can make your donation on the date you prefer. That's it. So Jill, be a quirky donor if you want to be a quirky donor. Don't feel bad. We all have our things, and your donors have their things too. Just get it right more often than you get it wrong, and you'll be in good shape.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jill, and then I'm glad that I hope that answered your question, Jill. I'm going to do a little facilitation. I think Natalie's next. Natalie had a question too, and I think you're unmuted, Natalie.
Hi, Rachel, and thank you, Nicole.
Yeah.
I was curious, would you recommend, I understand like the consistency with the images and the stories. Would you recommend like running the same images, stories for like 6 months, 1 year? Like how often do you change it up?
Oh, I would run it for a specific campaign. So like if you're using it for a year-end campaign, then you use those images and then finish, you're done. Spring campaign, new theme, new images, you know?
Okay.
And then if you're looking for images, that's often the hardest part, because especially if you're working with a nonprofit that deals with sexual abuse victims or domestic violence victims or addicts, things like that. There are lots of sites that offer stock images that you can purchase for very inexpensively. And you can use creative photography too. In fact, there is one group called Nashville Rescue Mission. They're in Nashville, Tennessee, and they are an addiction recovery program that helps people in recovery become more self-sufficient. And they raise $6 million a year off of their monthly newsletter. And let me tell you, if you want to become a student to see good communications, make a small gift. I gave them $10 just to get on their mailing list. And I know the lady who writes their newsletters. She's amazing. It costs them $2 million a year to produce, but they're raising $6 million a year off of it. They often have that challenge, and if you look and Google their newsletters, you can get some of the past issues. But one of the things that they did that was very clever, they had a lady whose story they wanted to tell, and she didn't want to have any identifying information. So they used very clever photography. They have an alley behind their office, and they took a picture of her walking down the alley, but it was from the rear view. Right, so you could see her profile, but not her face. They took another picture where you could see her opening her locker, but it was just her hands with the barest portion of the face. So, you know, if you have resources to do photography yourself, you can do that. But if not, stock is perfectly okay to use stock images.
Thank you.
Mandy I don't know if that was a comment. I thought it was really great if you wanted to bring that up to the group.
Yeah, I had worked in for-profit for more than 20 years and left a job that had, over time, after 18 years, just become miserable. And so out of the blue one day, I resigned and found myself switching gears. And I mention it because once I came to Family House, even on a volunteer basis before I took a position here, I fell in love with it. And so when I give people tours here of our facility and what we do, I've been told many times that they can feel my passion for the work that I'm doing. And I think that it compels people to want to give. They can get on board. They can relate to it once someone can actually get them in the game. So when I tell them of my story about how I came to Family House and volunteered for 6 months full time before I accepted a position, they could relate to how powerful the work we were doing here, that it compelled me to totally switch gears from where I had previously been. And I tell them stories of some of the things that have happened. For instance, you know, we try to give our children an even playing field with their peers that are not homeless. So for instance, at the beginning of the school year, we go through every child's teacher is contacted for what their school supply list is, and we send them to school with the exact same school supplies that their peers have. Not, this is the bag that I got at a distribution. They have everything in that bag that was all of their classmates have, so they don't stand out as being different.
Right.
And so when you tell them things like that, or the fact that one family had a daddy-daughter dance. You know, they didn't have the money to buy the pretty dress or the suit for dad, and we were able to provide those through donations, so that those children can go to that dance rather than come Monday, but we couldn't go to the dance because we didn't have the clothes to wear. So when you get to telling those stories during that tour, more times than not, it ends up with some sort of support, whether it's, you know, what else do you need for that dance? And we needed shoes, and she gave me money and she said, make sure they have shoes.
Yes. And you know, Mandy, what you say is so important. And I always say, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, a site visit is worth 1,000,000. You know, because people get to connect with the work. And I know it's more difficult to do site visits now at the time we're in, but this is where you can use videos, you know. So at Network for Good, our tool includes a video messaging feature. So, you know, you can send a video to individuals or to groups, but there are other standalone tools that do it. There's a tool called BombBomb, and it's basically allows you to embed the video in the email. And so you could easily, you know, do a tour of the facility, even if they're not there. It's not quite the same thing, but it does work. And I wanted to tell a story to help punctuate what you just shared, because it's really powerful. I used to coach a group called Ark of St. Sabina on the west side of Chicago. And at the time I started coaching them, there was a new executive director who came on board. And I asked her, who are your VIP donors? And she didn't know. So I helped her go into Salesforce and pull a list. And to her horror, she found out that there was a woman who had contributed $100,000 6 months before in a single check that never received a thank you letter. And she said, Rachel, I want to crawl under a rock and die, you know? I said, no, we need to tackle this head on. And so I helped her to create a card that said, oops, we goofed, and sent it with a 6-pack of gourmet brownies, Jocelyn introducing herself to the donor, saying she's the new executive director, and she just discovered that the lady had made a generous gift that had never been acknowledged because there was, you know, had a change of staff, and she wanted the chance to make it up to her. Would she agree to coffee? And the lady did. And so I coached Jocelyn on what to say to her. I said, bring her in for a site visit. So the lady came. She had never been to visit the center before, and she noticed that got to interact with the kids, and a lot of them didn't have coats. And so she said, oh my gosh, winter's coming. It's, you know, kids are growing. How do we help these kids with coats? And she told Jocelyn she would pay for a coat for every child that needed a new one. And so Jocelyn was going to accept her check. I'm like, no, ask her to get her whole family together, go to Burlington Coat Factory and purchase the coats with her, and then have a party to all the kids that are going to get coats, so she can physically give those coats to those kids and see the joy on their faces, which she did. And then Christmas was coming. And so I said, Jocelyn, what's your plan for Christmas? Do you have a Christmas show you can invite her to? And she says, yeah, but I can't invite her. I'm like, why? She said, because she's Jewish. I said, Jocelyn, Jesus was a Jew. You know, I said, teach them some Hanukkah songs and Kwanzaa songs and turn it into a holiday party and get her there with her whole family. And the lady brought her entire family and had a blast with the kids. The net result was the next year, she gave them $300,000. And when she asked why the upgrade, it was because she made 3 gifts of $100,000 each to 3 different nonprofits. And Jocelyn was the only one that said thanks. Can you imagine that? And so that was it. So you bring up a really good point, Mandy. It's important to find ways to bring donors into your work. It not only helps them to give more, but you also retain them for longer. All right, any other questions? You guys have been fantastic. I just have to say, I'm enjoying this chat.
Great meeting. I agree. Great meeting. Any other questions? If not, I just have a couple of wrap-up things here.
Before you do that, I just wanted to say thank you to Tim Wasserman for sharing the Pixabay link. I use that website quite a bit. They have great photos and they're not, you don't have to pay for them. They invite you to leave a tip. And if you're looking for more resources, I just published a book called No More Duct Tape Fundraising, and you'll see it here. The image is available on Amazon, or if you'd like a autographed copy, you're welcome to shoot me a quick email and just let me know, and I can arrange for that. And if you do have the time and could help me out, and you could leave me a review either on Goodreads or Amazon. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find the book, because that, it's search engine logic, right? But I look forward to the next session. So remember, for the next session, you're going to complete the worksheet that Nicole is going to email you later. It's a worksheet from an online program that I teach called Fundraising School. And basically, it's the same 4-pillar storytelling worksheet there. And then I ask you to bring a story of one individual story that you could have from your organization that could bring your work to life. And so if you have one, that's great. If you don't have one by then, just try to make one up based on what you know in the past. If you'd like to write an appeal and have me take a look at it, or choose some images or whatever you'd like, that session is really going to be for us to share all our pillars and then the stories that animate them, so that we can help you create a stellar year-end fundraising campaign. So with that